I'll do this one because you're going to do game next, right? I'm going to do game next too. So just have the clicker. Ready? Mm-hmm. Good morning. Welcome to Netmod. Hopefully we're all in the right place. So as usual, we have our agenda online, and here are the pointers to the various tools. I want to point out the last one because that's actually the way you get to Etherpad, and I'll talk about Etherpad in a moment. But it's basically our collaborative minute taking. So if you want to see what minutes are actually being noted or help correct them, go to that last URL, tools.ietf.org/wg/netmod, and then click on minutes and then Etherpad. So everything we do here at the IETF is covered by our Note Well. If you're unfamiliar with it, you can find it off the top of the IETF.org webpage. Basically, anything you say here, it becomes a contribution to our process. So we've already covered Etherpad. This is another way to get there. It's a little more cumbersome. It's really, really helpful if folks can jump on Etherpad, and when we have discussion, not necessarily presentation, but when you have a discussion, if you can help capture who's speaking and what comments are being said and make sure they're correct, that would be very helpful. Thank you. I'll be jabbering in just a moment as soon as I stop talking, but there's also, if anyone wants to jump on Jabber and help relay remote comments, that would be great. And we do have a couple of people who are remote. We have 2 sessions, this session and one on Thursday. In this session, we're going to focus more, as we usually do. We'll start with our working group documents, and those are really the key things that we want to help bring to closure and to get published. The second session has some more newer work for us to consider. The agenda hasn't been modified. It is what's been published. So, oops, that's good. We have, thanks to Chris Hops, who's actually here, we have output of a very nice tool called Working Group Status. Any chairs out there, you should definitely go look at it. But it helps break down where we are in terms of updates since the last meeting. We have one document that is in IESG processing. We have several working group documents that have been updated. The ones in green, or whatever color that is, those are on the agenda, so I'm not going to talk about them right now. The ACL model is post last call. There's been some good discussion on it. Kent is Shepherd, so I don't know if you want to say something? You look like you're getting ready to. No. Oh, okay. So that's post last call. There's been some discussion on it, and one of the things that we've been grappling with is what's the scope of what a base model should be, and do we try to have the base model cover all possibilities and then have features that allow different implementations to do different things, or do we say that we publish a base and then add features through augmentation? And there was a pretty strong objection to that latter approach on the email list, but it's our feeling that the right thing to do is complete a document, publish it, and if people want additional features, they can submit those as internet drafts. We run them through the process and they can augment the base. As long as the base isn't wrong, we don't want to hold that up and wait for perfection in order to publish something. That's not to say last call comments won't be addressed. I think there were a couple that are still open. They'll get addressed, but in terms of stopping our process and waiting until we have perfection, and as I said to one person, is we don't have one RFC that specifies the internet. So multiple RFCs, that's going to happen. Or even routing config, right? All right, Netmod entity, that's been around a little bit. There's been some discussion with BBF folks on this, and the real question from the working group is whether it's ready for last call. We'd like to move forward with it. If you have comments on it now and want them minuted, please come to the mic and do so quickly. If you don't want to bring to the mic, send it to the list. Model classification is post last call. We got an update on that, and it's now with me as Shepard to do the write-up and publish it, but we think that one's pretty much ready to go. We don't have any liaisons or communications that have come in since the last meeting, and we've been talking about a charter update on the list. So what we did is we said the charter that we had it was a little stale, and it didn't necessarily reflect everything that we were doing, and it wasn't always clear what the intent was, and maybe that's just because we have different chairs reading it. And so our intent was to clean up the charter, but have it not broaden the scope of the charter, just have it accurately capture what the group is actually doing. So that text has been circulated and discussed. We've had some tweaks. And if you're really interested, see the list for details. Now, where it sits right now is it's sitting with Benoit, and I moved it to ISU. Oh, great! So he did that last night. Sorry, I was in another meeting all morning and didn't notice. So thank you. Key areas of responsibility, these shouldn't be surprise to anyone. These are just rephrasing what we've done. Don't want to spend too much time here unless there's questions. Current milestones. So this is what was published to the list with the addition of the intended status. And the intended status is along the right-hand side, and that's just taken from the document. So there's no change here in terms of content. It's just a copy and paste. Now, one thing that has been discussed a little bit, and maybe I missed mail on this too last night. This isn't a pointer. It was the dates of October for both revised data store and schema mount. And we really like to ask the authors if they can bring that in closer. And personally, I'd like to set an objective of getting to last call in 2 months from now. And maybe that's insane. Lada is nodding his head, but I'll point out that he nodded his head before I asked if it was insane. So we have one author saying that's the schema, I think he's saying schema mount will be next week. That would be awesome. We have another author sitting behind Lada on revised data stores, also saying, yes, let's go faster. So, right. And both of these will be presented today, and we're really hoping to destroy that milestone. Okay. Great. Any questions on the update? Next.
Okay, so I'm going to present Yang next, since the slides come up. And I guess you can take this as a chair update or discussion. It's not an individual contribution per se.
I'm getting there, sorry.
Okay, great. All right, and I view this as the start of a discussion. The primary goal is just to raise awareness of the topic within the working group, and to, it's not necessary that we act on this now, just to start the discussion. What is Yang next? So it is, I guess, the name for the next version of Yang, whether it be 1.2 or 2.0. That's also a point of discussion. It's also the name of a GitHub repository that we're using of that name, where the issue tracker is collecting the various issues. And there's a URL for the GitHub repository. Word of caution here. So starting Yang next so soon could destabilize Yang. So this is a concern that's been forwarded to introduce the idea of the next version of Yang and how many people are depending on the current version of Yang. You know, so that's a concern. So maybe we should just work on some standalone extension drafts instead and defer the actual updating of Yang specifications for a future time. So 19 suggestions have been collected so far on the GitHub tracker. Here they are color-coded. The ones in red are what I consider to be significant features, a map statement, the introduction of an inactive metadata annotation previously known as conditional enablement, and a templating mechanism. So, and the last two are things that we oftentimes talk about in the revised data store document as being the difference between a running data store and an intended data store. So we could actually start working on those functions. In blue are those items which I consider to be refactoring oriented, moving things from 7950 into standalone documents, perhaps pushing them into Netconf workgroup maintained documents. And as far as I know, none of the suggestions actually necessitate or break backwards compatibility. So if we were to, at least none of these are promoting a 2.0 or suggest they would have to do a 2.0, it would be more 1.2. So refactoring, why bother, right? Some people are asking questions, right? Questions like, why is Yang seemingly Netconf specific? Why is Yang seemingly XML specific? Even though the specification itself says it's not either Netconf or XML specific, it kind of comes off that way. And also periodic house cleaning is good. So, you know, over time you have entropy, various drafts spin off, like the Yang metadata draft, which in it itself says that some future version of it could be rolled into the next version of Yang. But refactoring for refactoring's sake doesn't make sense, right? I mean, if we were to actually create a biz just for refactoring, it doesn't seem worth it. So if we were to do refactoring, we'd want to piggyback on top of another reason for why we're already creating the biz documents. Yes, question.
I believe there is another reason for doing this refactoring, namely that basically currently Yang depends both on netconf XML, but also on particular data stores. Some trees to be validated are defined in terms of running and so on. But so that means that it's all interrelated, and if you want to make any change wherever we want, we need to change basically everything. So one reason here could be to make Yang really as much as possible independent of the rest. So it can be like some building block for the rest, and we needn't go back and change it if we do any change in data stores and things like that.
And actually, while you were talking, it reminded me last night I was rereading Sue Harris' document, and in that there's some suggestions for modifications to Yang. And while some of them look like actually they could be done in, you know, if they affect other documents, one of them appears that they might actually impact the Yang specification as well. So just keep that in mind. So priorities per our AD, right? Primary near-term goal are, you know, revised data stores and schema now. Full stop. Including the Netconf parts. So we're the Netmod working group, but we need to be conscious of the fact that resources that are used to work and push forward these documents are, you know, shared in both working groups. Distractions, you know, to this primary goal is pretty much everything else. Every other draft that this working group is working on is the distraction source, including Yang Next, if we were to start Yang Next. But we also need to consider what I call the Netconf connection. The Netconf connection, okay, first off a disclaimer, you know, Netconf discussion should be deferred to the Netconf session, which will be later this afternoon, but this needs to be said here. There's a very real chance that the Netconf work group will decide to do a 6241 biz in order to support the revised data store solution. And if they were to do that, it would make sense for them to take the opportunity to factor text out of 7950 into that biz document for the reason I just mentioned on the previous slide. So sort of the question is, would this necessitate a 7950 biz? I mean, could they do a 6241 biz that had factored text from 7950 while still having a normative reference to 7950? I'm not sure. some fun facts. 6020 was released in October 2010. Yang 1.1 started in March 2014 and was released in August 2016. You can see it was 1.0 was with us for 3.5 years, and it took us 2.5 years to complete the update. So extrapolating 2.5 years from now would be August 2019. If we were to start today, chances are it would be 2019 when we'd actually have a Yang 1.2. So this is my last slide. Thoughts, concerns, options. I think are defer for now. Don't do anything. Maybe we could progress some extensions where there's sufficient interest. Just have the standalone drafts and move those extensions forward. Alternatively, we could start collecting items for or continue collecting items for 7950. We have a GitHub tracker, and we kind of start that process and see where that goes. And then the last, we could actually, or maybe we should wait to see what the Netmod working group decides with regards to 6241, and if they're going to do a biz there, and if that necessitates the need for us to do a 7950 biz. And there may be other options, so I'm open to anybody's thoughts here.
Hi, Eric Voigt. One of the things that I think is worth considering is what is Yang even? I know there's been a lot of unexpected tension over the years as people have had expectations of Yang meaning exposure of a device. Others have said, here's what's exposed as at a controller. And some of the questions in the language have focused around what is the domain that Yang is actually modeling. And if we go down this path, before we even say what should be in Yang, we should decide what Yang should be.
My personal thought is a controller is a kind of device as well. So, that distinction. But there's another thing that people many times talk about is the model, using Yang to model artifacts or standalone data structures that aren't necessarily tied to configuration.
Rob Shakir, Google. I think we should go down the route of Yang being a modeling language and not tie it to any application specifically. I also think that we should be working on Yang Next right now, and I think 2.5 years is a long time to wait for new features in a language. Especially as users kind of come up with these things, right? So I think it's a couple of years now since we wrote the, hey, it'd be nice to have a map, which means I'm still writing code that has to approximate maps from something that's imperfect in the modeling language. I'd kind of like to see some progress before 2019, maybe before I retire as well.
Rob, before you go, question for you. What do you think about using extensions to Yang versus doing a whole Yang Next?
The fastest way to iterate is the best.
So from my perspective, and this is a personal perspective, it's a lot faster to have a document that's focused on a specific extension and deal with those issues and run that through the process than it is to try to refactor a whole language. Now that said, that does mean that it becomes the conformance or support for extensions becomes a little harder to identify. And so there is a trade-off there that should be considered by the community, by the group. But in terms of getting new features fast, I think smaller documents work better. Again, personal statement.
Well, I don't go, while it may be really easier and faster to define such fundamental features using extensions, I'm strongly opposed to doing so, because that would mean that basically we would have any number of Yang all actually using the same version. So I believe it's really necessary, if we want to do something like that, to bump the version and really display that it's something different than what it used to be, because otherwise all vendors could define their own extensions to please their customers or whatever, and then it has no end. So everybody will have their own version of Yang, and the standard will go on, I believe.
So did you just argue for deprecating extensions, Yang extensions?
Not really. For example, I have now an individual draft that defines an extension that's completely optional, can be ignored by everybody. Only those implementations that can understand that extension can make some good use of it, but that's all right. So extension of this kind, or for example, extensions for the NACM, are all right because they can somehow be handled. But these fundamental things, changes to Yang that really change how we define validity of documents, for example, that in my view it's non-starter.
Okay, thanks.
Shakira, Google again. The problem is that as Lada points out, right, we're going to end up with compliance profiles of sets of extensions. So we're going to be saying, hey, we're going to have this supported, and that's kind of a problem that I think we're going to have to deal with anyway, because all of, like, what I'm observing is that there's not that many people moving their tool chains to 1.1. We've kind of removed the things that were 1.1 out of our modules to say, well, there's no real support for these across a number of implementations. So we just need to stick with the lowest common denominator. So that, I can see the argument for keeping a compatible set, but if we have to wait for so long, we're never gonna find out which of these ideas look good on paper or look good to some solution, but actually turn out to be really difficult to implement. You know, the ecosystem around Yang is still not that large. I would observe that as having written 2 code generation languages out of it and not really seen that many analogs. There's not many other places I can go and look and say, hey, there's this other code generation and I can learn from it. So it seems to me that we should be allowing testing to happen, even if it gives us a compliance problem, and come up with a solution to the compliance problem for what the set of extensions are, and then cut it at some point and say, these are the set of extensions we're going to bring in. A lot of the issues that we have in this working group, I think, are related to how quickly we want to iterate on things, because we're kind of saying, like with the ACL model, we're saying, hey, we can't do this because we can't come to a conclusion, because we're sort of getting our chisels out and carving into an RFC. Whereas if we have a much more, an idea that actually this is how we're going to iterate through a few business, and then we're going to get to this thing being the next thing, then we'll probably work better to figure out what's implementable and what's not. Like, so we're at major revision 3 or 4 in some of our models. So we've already had to make 3 sets of backwards incompatible changes amongst the implementations. I don't see why the models and the work that comes out of this working group will be any different.
Yeah, and there are different models that different SDOs work on. And there are SDOs out there that'll do some very focused changes and in independent documents, but once they become stable, they then wrap it up into a new major rev. And, you know, we could take that approach. So this is all for good discussion within the working group.
Right, it's like pulling off head of master versus pulling off a release branch, right? So I kind of think that head of master should be Yang next, and we should always have things that are on there, and then there should be the release branch of what's, you know, when do we cut that and give it a new version number.
Right, but since we are document driven, that sort of implies that we need documents that cover those pieces.
Right, so we should, the thing I guess I'm saying is, in support of we can do extensions quicker, is like, get those in, get them in as like they were pull requests, merge them in and see how we use them, kind of get more support than 1 or 2 implementations looking at it, and then cut it at some point and say, okay, now it's worth doing a major revision. And that kind of kills the compliance problem later down the line. So
I look forward to seeing the map extension internet draft at the next meeting.
We already put it in an internet draft like 2 years ago.
Oh, okay. Before my time, sorry.
John Messenger, Adver Optical. Thank you for teeing me up. I wanted to suggest that you concentrate on scoping your projects, and that's a different problem from scoping your language definitions and the way that they're structured inside. So if you want to do the 2 features, the killer features that you mentioned on the slide as the near-term goals, do those as projects. Don't accept the distractions, and find a way of administratively scoping your work so that's clear to all the participants. As to how that gets rolled in, it's probably above my head, but I think the previous discussion is the right way to go. And you mentioned the method of working where you develop, let's call them amendments to a particular version, and then when those amendments are complete, they are rolled in. It's not a matter of they have to be rolled in as a decision, they become rolled in. So it's a matter of course that once those independent amendments have been done, then they become part of the major document. And that seems to be a tried and trusted method.
Yeah, I sort of like Rob's analogy of that it's sort of like code. So, you know, that's just getting the code ready for the next release, and then it automatically becomes part of it. And so maybe that's a way of logically thinking about our internet drafts and RFCs. It's a little different.
So I like Rob analogy as well, and we are getting close to the point of no return where split between extensions done privately, mainstream done here. It's going to get more and more complicated to merge. So I think we need to work on extensions, and your working group provide guidance how those extensions are integrated, as well as looking into how to bump up Yang version and integrate all of them. And it needs to be done today, not 2 years down the road. We are really, really far on this road.
Thank you. Any other comments? All right, thank you.
So revised data store.
Okay, I'm Martin Mjörklund. I'm going to present the revised data store document. This document affects the architecture where Yang is being used. Right? So it affects possibly the Yang language, the Yang data models, but also the Yang of the protocols that are using Yang. So in this presentation, I'm going to just focus on the Netmod related changes. That is the proposal itself and how it affects Yang and the Yang data models. And in NetConf tomorrow, we're going to present how we propose to extend NetConf and RESTConf to work with this model. Okay, so the document, just a quick recap of some of, I won't go through the entire document, just a quick recap. First of all, how many people have actually read this document? Okay, quite a few. So it has, the idea with this architecture framework is that it has a set of definitions, common definitions. So one, of course, very central definition is the definition of the data store. And the data store is a conceptual entity which contains instantiated data. So it's instance data in a data store. It doesn't have to be a database or anything. It's a conceptual entity that can be addressed. You can possibly modify it and hopefully read from it. Each data store has a schema, which is the set of Yang modules that describe the data in the data store. And different data stores might have different schemas. So one of the main problems, we try to solve a problem, which is in the original data store model, inherited from original NetConf. It's also part of the Yang specification, and it's also in the NetConf, is that the operational state cannot be accessed separately. It was always accessed together with the running operation. And this led to the problem of split data trees, either at the top or further down the tree. And that also makes it difficult for clients to understand the relationship between something that has been configured and the related operational state. Okay, so here's a picture from the draft. It has changed slightly from the previous version of the document, based upon comments. So we propose, in the architecture, we propose these 5 data stores. And the model is extensible. So the idea is that we can define new data stores as needed. I don't think that this is something that will happen often, but the architecture allows. So in the picture you have the normal data stores that came from Netmod, which is candidate and started and running. And then there's a new data store called intended. And all these 4 data stores would normally, or they would always have the same schema, contains of set of YAML modules, and they always contain just config-true data types. And then there's another new data source called operational state that has all nodes, both config-true and config-hold lengths, and it's read-only data source. And the idea is that configuration flows down to intended and then down into operational, if it's possible to actually apply that configuration from intended. Might be that the configuration contains data for resources that do not exist, and in that case, that configuration will not be part of operational. Operational will also contain data that the system creates by itself, like system created interfaces, data from dynamic configuration protocols, data from dynamic data stores, for example, from I2S.
Hey, Bierman, I'm a little confused. If the problem was that get had config true and config false together, and it was too much data to get, then how does putting config true and false together in operational data store fix anything? Now I'm still doing a get data and getting way too much data same as I got before.
The problem was not that you got too much data. I mean, the operation state contains all that data. That's just a fact, right? The problem is how you structure the data. So in this model, you would have all the config true data nodes would be instantiated in the operational state, but the instance data would be different from what you have in configuration. Right? So in the interfaces list, you would have the set of interfaces that are actually being used by the system, regardless if they are created through the configuration.
So
or if
I understand it's used to show that what has been applied versus what is intended, but it still means that if I do a get on a tree that has a whole bunch of counters or something in it, I get all those counters, and all I wanted was to get the difference between applied and intended, but now I'm throwing in all the config false stuff too, right?
Well, the problem was we've never tried to solve the problem of the state is a lot of data and trying to come up with clever operations to prune that data. That's a separate problem. This proposal just focuses on what's in those data stores.
Okay, so it's
And then
left to
there's
the
a separate
protocol
problem,
to make
how do you
it
actually
work.
access this? Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so another thing we propose is to use the metadata annotation that we call origin that is set on the data in operational state, so that the clients can keep track of, or the clients can see where the data actually came from. So as data flows into the operational state, it's being tagged with this origin annotation. So you can see if it came from static configuration, from some kind of dynamic configuration, created by the system itself, or the fourth origin that we have defined is default. If it comes from a default in the data model, then it's being tagged as default. And the idea is that clients can then either just learn this or use filters to filter data based on the attribute value. So for example, it's fairly easy to get all the data that represents applied configuration. That would be all the data with origin static, depending on how you define applied configuration. Yes, yeah.
Hi, this is Henk Bockholz from the Fraunhofer Institute. The current draft includes terminology that differentiates state from dynamic configuration. And I think this is a huge improvement because it's literally the problem I had, which I intended to come here to address, and then I read it and I was, oh, it's gone. And now but it did not reach that point. So if we would include your terminology that you excellently defined here in the draft, in the origin module thingy, then it would be great, because state and dynamic configuration somehow look the same, but from a security standpoint, they most certainly aren't. And so I would like to see that new improvement get into there.
And then definition.
So again?
into this definition.
into this origin definition, because all the security-oriented monitoring work groups like SECAM and I2NSF and so on, they really want to have a understanding how something came to be in order to assess its persistence and its effect on operations.
Yeah.
And this is really helping, and this is really done right. And if we use the same words and mean the same thing, we will always come, we will all be happy. So just align, I would like to align this with you. And if we are all happy on this, then great.
Okay.
Because then we can do the event notification stuff.
Could you just restate your name for the minutes, please?
I'm Hank Birkholz.
Thank you.
So Hank got my first point. The second point is, were you going to consider additional dynamic and then some other identifier like I2S protocol or ephemeral or stuff, or did you guys decide not to go through that?
Or the origin attribute? Yeah, I mean, this is defined as Yang identities, which are
Yeah.
extensible, right? So you can, the idea is that if you define I2S data stores as a dynamic data store, you would probably define an identity that derives from dynamics that is called I2S.
Okay,
or
that's fine.
Whatever
That's-
name.
I didn't find that in the document. Maybe I missed it in some of the stuff.
We could clarify that.
That would be really wonderful. Thank you.
The example, okay, so the example classes, but it probably should be clarified in the text. So there is a section about how new data stores can be defined, and it lists a couple of things that you need to consider while you define your new data store, and this is one of them. Right. Okay, so implications on the Yang language. We don't believe that we need to have a new Yang language version in order to support this. It also means that a server that implements this new model can certainly continue to support both Yang version 1 modules and Yang version 1.1 modules. It might be the case that if those models have a split tree, some data might be duplicated in the operational data store, but it's still possible to support it. And it depends on how the model is being defined. Yeah, some clarifications are probably needed, and this is, details are still need work on those details, but the expat context for notifications of disease and actions should be clarified so that the context should rather be the operational state rather than the state data, not running configuration data store as it's being defined. This doesn't affect any data models. And implications on Yang modules. Again, no changes to existing Yang modules are required. You can absolutely have one of your own data models and use it with this revised data store model. However, if we do new models, they should use a combined tree, as is possible with this model, and we should revise some of the published modules to use a single tree instead of this split tree, so that we really use the benefits of having this new data. Yes.
This is Alex Clem. One question, because you mentioned no changes will be required. What about, or do you foresee a need to reference, to have references between data stores? Because to have some object in one data store explicitly refer to something that is, in an operational or in an applied or what have you.
Right. So references in this model would be defined within the data store, and references across data store. I think that is problematic, though. I mean, you would really tie the data models to the set of data stores that are being supported. So especially if you want to move away from that and have Yang more standalone, it's tricky to have that kind of references.
Yeah, I guess there are potentially some use cases when you have, for instance, require instance, and you might have a different target data store where an instance exists versus a given.
So what I'm hearing is that you would have I mean, you would be looking at something like a required instance true, but in a separate data store. Right? Is that what you're saying?
Right, for example.
Yeah. So having references from like running into operation state, of course, is not a very good idea because it might make running invalid because the state changed on the device. So that's not really possible anyways. I'm not really sure between which data stores we would have such references.
Okay, sure, yeah, maybe future discussion. Thanks.
Question Hops T systems. So I have a sort of interest in, I think, the between state. Like new models, I'm assuming this is sort of the recommendation when this is published. Yeah, so if we're pretty sure this is going to be published, there's a lot of data models under development right now, and I would love to see them not have split state and config. And so I've been recommending, I guess in the routing working group, we actually go over options for the routing models to use. My recommendation is that we design models in anticipation of this if you can. And that's generally, I think in the majority of models, it's possible. The only models it's not is where you have state created by the system that's shadowed by config true. You know, and if it's all like just config values like MTU, right? Like if you config the value MTU and you want to read the applied value, until this actually just gets implemented, you could just have that be a single node, right? And then you just don't get the benefit of intended and applied until this is rolled out. But what we do get are the models between now and the time this is published being the way they should be in the end. And I would like to push for that to be an option for people. And I think it's not really clear to people, right? Like the complexities of what I just said, right? They're just writing a model and they say, I've got this config and everyone else did this state thing. And so, you know, maybe if we had some kind of direction that says, as long as you're willing to live, unless you have this issue with your model, just write it like this.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. And I mean, in the worst case, if this for some reason doesn't work out, then you could revise those data models and add this separate state. So that might actually be an easier way to handle this problem.
Hello, I'm Zheng Wangying from Huawei. My question is whether we can keep the young modules, not use the split trees. Because I think the different data store is just the data store implementation level, not the young module level. I think we can use the filter as a condition to separate a different data store, but not change the young module itself. If we add the split tree in the young modules, that means every app should know the data store difference. But I think that is the implementation level, not the data model itself.
So I'm not sure I understand the question. What was?
My question is not use the split trees in young modules, but just add a filter in the netconf condition as netconf condition to separate a different data store.
So not use the metadata annotation, is that what you meant? Not use the origin attribute?
What?
Did you mean not use the origin attribute, or? Don't split config and state.
Yeah, I mean, don't change the current young module. Maybe no need to revise the future revised published module. No need to use the split trees. Just add split trees in netconf or some other protocols like netconf to separate different data store.
So you're talking about the existing data models, that you don't want to change the existing data models to have a combined tree.
Yes,
That's
yeah.
Yeah, so that the purpose of doing that is, so there are quite a few models that will augment the current data models, right? So they would, if we kept the state and config as separate trees, those data models would have to also augment those data trees. So we kind of this split that we have will follow to all the modules that augment these data models. So they affect the design of the original model affects all the other data models. So getting that model or those basic models right affects so many other data models. So that's why we propose to do this.
Okay, I will send my comments in the mail
Okay.
list.
Benoit Claes. So I would like to come back to the point that Chris made about the transition, right? We've got people who want to do services, they need Yang models, they need these Yang models, need to publish this in the IETF. So at which point in time, okay, let me phrase it differently. It could be a great achievement here if we will all agree that all the modules that have to be published from now on will have a single combined tree, because we've got people waiting for guidance. The last one we gave was like dash config and dash state. So maybe that's a discussion that we could try to close here. I see people from routing here, so maybe that's the right time. So Jeff, routing group shares, was telling full support. So I'm not sure how you want to drive this, or maybe I could drive the discussion, but that's a key point. So the previous guidance was given in the Netmod mailing list. Now I think that we could do the same thing, and I would spread that through routing, because right now this is mainly routing which is defining modules.
So I mean, the formal way of doing this advice is on the next slide, which is on the Yang guidelines. After Yang guidelines, it should it has a section about this split data tree, and it of course needs to be updated. But meanwhile,
I agree with you. Now I make a distinction between the decision and how we communicate it.
Okay.
So tomorrow we are having routing working group meeting, which is mostly dedicated to Yang, where Lou is going to be present. I mean, most people who are here are going to be there. If we could provide guidance how to do things, and from now on we do it in particular way, I think would be a huge win for industry and for IETF. So,
And who are you, Jeff?
Jeff Ventura, in this case, chair of routing working group. So if we can decide today that going forward we do it this way, we reiterate this decision in routing. Fantastic.
Just quickly, I think at the end of the line here, we'll ask for a raise of hands. So let's have the discussion right now as to, and understand the pros and cons, the benefits, the issues, and we'll ask the group at the end of this line.
So 2 points. One, so Rob Shakir, Google. The cross data store references, we've found a few cases where I think you will need them. So we have things like a components tree, and there's component configuration that's only applicable when the component is of a certain type. So like the line card power, you can only set when it's a line card, or a transceiver property, you can only set when it's a transceiver. But you don't know what the system plugged into that slot or that component until such time as it's actually plugged in. So we have those cases where, yes, it does invalidate it, but it's kind of like there's no real other way, or you end up with a very messy model to be able to have like, hey, I have a specific tree for line cards, etc.
Right, but probably what you have is that you accept the configuration even though the line card might not even be there, and then once it's plugged in, then you actually apply, or the system will apply that configuration.
Right,
And so
but
the reference is kind of it's a dangling reference. Once it's fulfilled, then the system will trigger this and actually use that.
But the when statement in the model needs to refer to the operational data store in the configuration one, if you have different data stores. Sorry, I can't listen in stereo.
Even in the current interface model that has been published, we have this situation, and the when statement only refers to configuration data, right? So
That's what he wants.
So we're already referring to state data. So
I was just going to say, it's not an actual data store issue. It's just being able to refer to state.
right.
So you don't need cross data store.
Well, but the state of what what the component is a bit different. Yeah, so we can take it offline. I think we should work through the cases as to whether it's needed or not.
Yeah. Okay.
Just on this guidance, this is not sufficient guidance to say that if this is what Netmod's going to come out with, that there should be a single tree. Consistency for users is really a really big problem, right? We have a lot of experience dealing with people trying and explaining how the models work, where to find something in the model. It should be in a single tree. It doesn't give you any level of consistency, right? So I would like to see much more of, it gives you some consistency, but there's one route. Great. So I would like to see us actually have a debate as to how to lay out models in routing, if that's what we're going to do. But this isn't really, this is a no-op to me as a recommendation, basically.
So is this currently in the draft? I don't remember if this is at this stage.
It's in the appendix, yes.
It's in the appendix. So one of the questions is where do we capture these guidelines? And wherever we capture them, we're going to have to do some good vetting of what is the specific language.
Mm-hmm.
And we can progress the technical solution independent of the guidelines, but we also, in an independent document than the guidelines, but we should do them at the same time and make sure that when we have the technology available, we also have a good understanding of what the guidelines are at that time, but we also have to figure out how we're going to get there.
Right. So speaking on parallel development, so we have a set of models that we've been through this consistency discussion about, like how do we make them all feel the same? How do we make users be able to use them? We have a protocol that interacts with them. So we've kind of got a bunch of experience as to how this might work in terms of that solution. One of the learnings from that process has been how being consistent across the two specifications has been very important, because it's been where we've said things in one specification and haven't quite cleared them up in the other bit, and they were decoupled. It didn't work out, and from a user perspective, that made it even more complicated. So I kind of would like to, if the IETF is going to go down this route, I'm not going to say that we'll adopt it, but it needs to be more than just like a few bits and bobs where a user or someone trying to implement it has to kind of glue them together into a concept, because that's kind of where we feel to be right now.
So I think there were two issues that you raised. One was how do you actually structure your data model, regardless of data source, just how do you structure that? And that's a separate discussion, right? It's important, of course, but this work does not target that at all. So, and then the other issue was about this recommendation being a no-op. I don't think it is, because the current recommendation is to have a separate state tree and config tree on the top. Now the recommendation is to have a single tree with no branching, right? So it's a big change. It's not a no-op, and it affects all the data models.
Okay, 3 points. I'll start probably the one that's most specific. Your IETF recommendations you accepted, or at least that we sent to you, and you said you would accept, actually imply cross data store, because you have to have something that says, is the interface really there? And the interface configuration is owned by usually the one data store, unless you want two people owning an interface. I don't see where that's really useful. So you have a case where, if you're trying to do a fib in IETF and you're trying to refer to an interface to know it's really there, it should be in the config data store where it's been defined, but you've got to do it. One example is you copy it over, but I don't see where that gives you the operational state. So you have a problem. That's in some sense what the topology, what Alex was trying to tell you, and this is, you just can't say not data stores, or you have to reject the IETF requirements because we have this issue. Does that make sense?
We're probably talking about different things. So when that's why I was trying to clarify with Alex. When you say reference to another data store, is that something that you want to have validated as part of this data store? So you would not accept a modification to the data store if the thing that you refer to does not exist. And if that's true, what happens then if the thing that you refer to goes away? What happens with the validity of your data store?
So again, that is true. I don't disagree with that. It is the read reference from the other data store for both config true and config false that you are seeing cross data store. That is part of the validation and challenge inside of ephemeral or inside cross-validation. In my proposal, I had that type of validation to go up to Yang, but several people have made the suggestion it should be within individual implementations. That's fine, but you need the cross data store reference so you can know whether the interface is up or down. Did that sentence go too many things all at once? That's fine. I sometimes do that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would like to need to see a proposal of what such a reference would actually look like in a language. Because what
Okay,
we've
I
been
think
talking
we
about
have.
so far is perfectly fine. Requirements is false and text that describes what's going to happen. I'm all for that. So we're talking about formal references in the data model that references some other data source.
I will reference IR2R, since you are a Yang doctor, I will reference the IR2S models for topology and the dependencies that go for it as examples.
So
I think, yeah.
in that case, I think we're fine. Because
Okay.
Maybe I can jump in here for a clarification. It's not a reference to any other data store. As I understand, it's always a reference to the operational data store.
No, that is not,
Well,
that is not always true.
Config to
It could be
operational
config
or
and
dynamic
it
to
could be
operational.
another data store itself. It needs to be flexible. It
Okay,
needs to be either, that you can have multiple dynamic data stores based on your description in your text. So we need to be able to say we have something like multiple instances of a routing thing and you want to refer from one routing instance to another that are running their own unique dynamic data store management protocols. We must be able to refer. That's the second case. It's a little odd for Netmod to think about, but it is a routing example.
And the second part of that clarification is I don't think it's in terms of validation. I don't think they're looking for validation so much as the system would resolve the reference. So
which is fine.
Resolve or constraint, we need the information, how constraints are defined. If I've listened to Andy carefully enough, how you define, reference and then constraint, that's the function of the data store doing it, right? If the topology in the control plane data stores is trying to figure out if the interface is really there, and then what it does with the constraints when it figures out either when it's in the configuration or whether it's in the operational state, that belongs to the data store that's doing the thing, and that's its problem. So I'm not trying to force that problem into Yang. I'm just saying we need to be able to have read reference, which I think Martin said was workable.
Yeah, I think if I understand you correctly, I think that this is wonderful.
Okay, we'd probably like you to give a read through things and see if we've messed something up. Second point, it's in this discussion that they're about to call. I need clarification. I am working group chair of 2 working groups where we've had 5 years on Yang models, much like one of them's the BGP that Rob's probably been implementing. Are those bound by this guideline? Because they're out deployed and that's really going to be a non-starter for life.
You can ask that again once we figure out what the question is that has support within the working group.
Oh, okay, so that would you add that to the whatever part of the question you're going to add?
No, maybe.
No.
Why don't you come up afterwards if we haven't addressed it?
Okay, I don't really mind coming up again. I just,
Yeah.
And plus one to Hank's comment about security, because I'm working I2 NSF. And thank you, Martin, for being patient through all of this.
I'll state my name, Rick Taylor. Just going back to the guidelines. Guidelines for people developing new models without having to wait for this work to actually hit an RFC number. Can I request that's actually a working group document? Because just some comments on the mailing list disappears down in history and we lose it. And I know I'm saying, can I have another document to talk about a document that's coming? Even if it never actually goes that far through the process, just being able to go to the data tracker and say, oh, look, there's a document for me because I'm writing a model and I want to make sure that my model doesn't need to be completely rewritten when this finishes. Yeah. I think a doc is the right format. Where it lives, I'm not sure.
Yeah, you have a really good...
I would... Well, because this one isn't finished yet.
First of all, we
have
to
okay, yeah, sure.
Mike, please.
Sorry. Yeah.
So the notion that we can have a document to capture some state within a working group and it doesn't ever become an RFC is actually perfectly valid and a good one.
Good.
And we had a side conversation of whether or not the guidelines should in fact be its own document, or does it go in another document? I don't think either of us were thinking it would not be in any document. So we agree, yes, it should be documented.
It will be documented.
Yeah, but I want it
personally
documented
like
in a
standalone.
document
We
rather
like
than
bundling it,
somebody
we'll see where
just
we end up.
putting a post on the mailing list is documented with a small d. I just was asking for documented with a big D.
Yeah. Now that we have this
Yep.
sort of effort coming to a close, or we can see, you know, the end on the horizon, I think you're absolutely right. We have to have a document that covers it.
Rob Wilson
One of-
says, go.
Sorry, one of the issues we're going to grapple with is the time dependency in the guidelines.
Wouldn't it be possible to just do this in 687 bis?
Can you lean in a little?
Yeah, wouldn't it be possible to do this in 687 bis?
Yeah, so
Take them back and
so that's perfectly reasonable to do it there. Another way is we publish it in a standalone document, and that document identifies that it updates 6087 bis. That's
Right.
another
So-
perfectly reasonable way from
you're
a
saying
process standpoint.
publish 687 bis as it is today, and then quickly spin it.
Yes, we can stop 6087 bis and do it in that. That's option one. Option two is we do 6087 bis. Option three is we publish 6087 bis as it is, and then we do a separate document which identifies that it's an update to 6087 bis that only covers this one piece.
Can we agree first on the decision before the where?
So Rob Wilson, Cisco, just two comments. The first one is to Sue regarding the sort of references across data stores. I think a different way of thinking about that is maybe about information flowing between the data stores. So I see rather than having the references go across, it might make more sense for some of the operational state to be flowing into the ephemeral I2S data store, and then you do the validation within that data store. You allow there to be a time delay as things get updated and things propagate through the system.
Sue, I'm sorry, can you use the mic just because we do have quite a number of people remote?
Rob sent this nice comment on the list, and I've been thinking about it. So he asked if it would just be good information that flows, and the answer is for Alex's topology model, we need the latest up-to-date information so that flow is, having any time delay is really thing. The other thing is if it flows and it sticks, then there's space, and many of these things want to be small implementations.
So, Sue, I would just say, I wouldn't worry about the memory because it's easy to forget this, but these are conceptual, right? So the state actually it can just be a pointer, right? It can be the same state, and both data stores point into that state.
Yeah, that's my same point as well. It's
As long
conceptual.
as you put it in conceptual and it's pointed to go across.
Yeah, maybe. So the second point I wanted to make and discuss is we discussed what's going to happen, I think, more with the new drafts and saying that those. Sorry. So the point we made with the new models was they should all be combined confident states. Have we said that we also want to list the current models, the standardized models, and actually deprecate the existing state nodes and merge those into the config tree as well? So I think that's something that should also happen. I don't know if that's been made clear.
A good thing to put in this new document, whatever it is.
Okay, I think I'm actually, there's already talked about the next steps, I guess. So there's the last bullet there is we have the RC 6244, which is the Netmod and Yang architecture document. It's informational, but it mentioned this split state and config thing. So at some point in time, we might want to do something about that. It's probably not very urgent.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do you want to do anything? Are the authors recommending doing anything with it now?
No.
Okay, great. Sorry, Martin, can you stay here for a second? Yeah. So what do the authors think about in terms of when we could bring this to last call?
Yeah, it depends on the comments from the working group, but I think there are some edits that we need to do. Currently, we have an appendix with all the stuff that is supposed to go into other documents, so we need to remove that, publish a version without that. And there was a comment from Andy about the section on how to specify new dynamic data stores that should probably be more generic and talk about how to define new data stores in general. We should make that change. So I think from our perspective, we can have a new version of the document pretty soon, and then it's yeah, I guess we need comments from the working group.
But we could collect those comments in the form of a last call?
Sure.
So
Unless people have good comments now, that would be, of course, very much appreciated.
The last thing I want to do is Christian Hops from T-Systems is to slow this down, but I did just hear a kind of big thing to resolve, right? I mean, the references or flowing, you know, whatever the resolution is to the references between data stores, seems like that would not be addressed in last call issue. But hopefully, I mean, I really want that to go fast. But
Yeah, so if someone has a proposal for something that's not in the document, what to do with those references, then we need to see that proposal.
Maybe while we're here this week, we can have a sidebar and try to resolve that discussion as well. Okay, so I've heard, well, earlier Lou suggested 2 months, hopefully optimistically, and then others were saying July. I'm sorry, another comment of Mike?
Recently, Benoit stated on the mail list that this is going to be published as standard document. Do we need to revert a few statements saying must do, should use, or something? I mean, currently it reads like a concept paper, but not a standard document. Are there statements we need to reformulate? I'm just asking, or I'm not insisting.
I don't know off the top of my head. We need to look at the document to see if there's anything that needs to be restated.
Okay, sorry, I thought that might have affected our discussion about last call, when we might be able to. So 2 to 3 months, something like that.
For a new version of the document?
Yeah, with
For last call.
to address the issue with the references that we were just discussing, and have a new version of the document.
If someone wants to do something there with references, we need a proposal. I don't see how that would work. So,
All right, but let's have a sidebar conversation this week, and hopefully. So, okay, I'm going to optimistically say roughly 3 months is when we might have a new document that we could potentially progress to last call. Okay. All right. So now, with that in mind, we need to have this discussion and I guess a decision as to how to move forward with a recommendation for IETF working group documents, Yang models that are in progress, as to which strategy they should use for their operational state. And one option, of course, is to recommend that all working groups adopt the strategy proposed with the revised data store solution, which is to no longer have a top-level dash state tree, to have a single combined tree, and with the expectation that this solution would then provide the operational state for those config true nodes, as well as for the system-generated values in future reference. Sorry, just 1 second, I'll complete my thought. Of course, if we were to take that, everyone has to understand that while the models can be defined and progress, and they wouldn't actually be usable until the protocols were realized to enable the access to that data. I mean, as the Netmod working group, we can go ahead and do that, right? The models are independent of transport, and but just realize that the recommendations could have that impact. Okay, so great with that, and also I just want to keep mindful of the time. We have 6 minutes to conclude this, so please go ahead.
Christian Hops, T-Systems. So I disagree with what you just said. You said we can't use the models until this is published. I mean, my comment earlier was talking about there's tons of models that you might not really care about intended and applied, right? You just assume that applied is applied. You assume your intended is applied. That works like 99% of the time, right? There's no reason to even stall the model. It can get published with the assumption that you'll eventually be able to differentiate between intended and implied when this is published. But there's no reason to block on it, right? And so there's only a specific type of data that's modeled where this is a problem. And it's a problem where you have config data and operational state that are in conflict, right, on the same node, right? So I configure interfaces on this node, but the system also creates them and there's no backing config, right? That's where you have to actually literally have a difference, right? But when there's a one-to-one mapping between the config and the operational state of applied, right, or there, right, then you don't need to wait for this. It just means you don't know, right? You don't, if the device chooses to accept your configuration but not apply it, you don't know that it didn't apply it. But that's, you know, that's kind of what we have anyway, right, in a lot of devices. And I'm just saying there's no reason to block it. This is also not a permanent thing. As soon as this is published, you get the applied, right? But there's no reason to block the model.
Well, one thing to keep in mind, it's not the publication of this that gives it to you. It's the publication
And the
of the
implementation.
support in the protocols, so netconf, resconf, whatever protocol you're using, and the implementation of that.
Mhm.
So there's a little bit of a lag. So we can't just say, once we finish our work in Netmod, it magically is available everywhere.
Yeah, so all I'm saying is I don't want a big, huge process hurdle to sit there and everything to block behind it. If we're not sure that those things are going to get done, then I would not make this recommendation to do it this way. But I'm pretty sure that this is going to publish, the netconf and resconf changes are going to get published. And when they do, then all the models just work. And then we don't have another 6-month process waiting for those to get published, right? In their scattered way around all the different working groups. And the last point I was going to make, in other SDOs, right? I mean, this isn't just our recommendations here can be viewed by other people writing models. It doesn't necessarily just mean IETF, but the implementation of, this solution along with netconf or resconf affects everyone. So I think the recommendation is pretty important. I think Rob's about to shoot me for recommending we do it this way.
Chris, I'm sorry, but I'm confused. You started off by saying that you were disagreeing with the vote, or we didn't think we could have.
So you had said that you said making this recommendation that just design for the future, right? Do it right now is what, right now. You said that they would all block on this solution. And I'm saying they don't need to block.
Oh, okay, I understand. What I was doing is I was just trying to make everyone aware that there would be this issue. Yes, the IETF can make this recommendation, but realize that it wouldn't come to fruition until actually everything else downstream occurred. Yes.
Right, Rob Shakir, Google. I agree completely, right? Just if we punt on this with zero implementation experience, no one has proven this thing, right? It's written down on paper, and then there's no real looking at like how easy this is to implement for any existing implementation. Then maybe I don't fall into, well, Chris, the 99% of use cases of one user, 0% of my use cases. So like average 50, it's not really a good solution, right? We have to look at it. We have to look at what the set of use cases are and whether that's a reasonable thing. And just to go back to is the recommendation strong enough? The open config models don't have a dash state and dash config split at the root. So do they comply with this recommendation? Because on that wording, they do, but I don't think in the spirit of what you're recommending, they actually do, right? So you probably need to have a look at what the recommendation actually is to get there to be a usable solution for users, and then we should also look at what the implementation timeline, complexity, etc., is before we like bet on one horse.
So you're right about the recommendation. I mean, this is one slide, one sentence on one slide. If you look at the actual text in 687, it's actually one section that talks about various ways of doing this. So the intention is captured on the slide, but then of course it needs to be written down in text value.
But from my last read of 6087 biz, there wasn't I don't think I came out with like, oh, I should build it like this type recommendation. I kind of came out with a taxonomy of ways that I could build it maybe. And I'm saying that I don't think that that's a good recommendation, because the problem here is like, don't underestimate how hard it is to explain to users how it's different over here because this model was built by this working group and this one was built by this other one. That's really, really, really tricky because the lines between what was built by whom are very blurred.
And also, to your point about open config models, that you're right, they would fall into this recommendation. They have a single root, that's fine.
Yeah.
I don't think we can capture all the various ways you can create data models.
And I just want to clarify that the vote would be on for IETF models, so it wouldn't affect open config models.
So the IETF BGP model is open config right now. So we've stalled any kind of input on those models because we published something, we're iterating it, but there's no clear guidance as to whether that thing should be progressed or not, and it's implemented in multiple vendors' systems right now. So to me, we're kind of making a decision. If you say we're not going to use that, that's fine, but there's re-implementation effort for whatever the alternative is, and there is not a competing proposal in IDR. So there's a lot of things that ride on this that are not clear as to what it's not clear as to what the actual solution will be. And I'm just going to put on the record, I'm not going to write a BGP model for the IETF.
So to quickly address that, I don't think the recommendation is going to say all models must go back and change to this new one. If you've already got a year or years of implementation and experience or whatever, there's nothing in this proposal that says that model doesn't work. But to counter that, you're also saying it'd be nice if they all look the same because explaining multiple structures to users is hard. So that's a good point, but I think in the case of this, you just move it forward and maybe look at changes later. But I was good. So the open config style, though, of this, I think it's just commingling state with config is what we're looking at here, right? So any sort of split where you have config and state is going against the spirit. That's why you said the spirit, yeah. And the reason to remind everyone again is because right now we have things like the same list of interfaces multiple times, right? I mean, that's what I think the current way of doing it is confusing, right? If I have a bunch of interfaces, I want them in one list, and then underneath that list, I find my interface, and then I find the config and the state for it. I mean, that's the reason we want this, is because it's confusing to have replicated lists of the same thing.
Just as a heads up, we're going to actually have a revised initial question. So just
Benoit Claes, the IDR and the BGP Yang model is a non-issue for me because there is no BGP model in IDR right now.
That sounds like an IDR discussion between
I thought it expired.
with the IDR chair. Excuse me, I don't know what's going on with my throat. Apparently I can't. Right.
Benoit, if we track all your documents that expire for op state, we'd have a different comment. Let's not go there.
Okay, so we are,
but
speaking of not going there, we are pretty much out of time on this discussion, and we'd like to ask a couple of questions, and apparently I can't ask any more questions today.
So the first question, I guess, is, do we have enough information to ask the room for their for their preference? I mean, do we need to write this down and put on the list and actually have that more well formulated? Do people have enough information currently? Raise your hand if you think you have enough information currently to try to make a vote. So about half the room. All right. All right. How many people don't think they have enough information? So yeah, less. Maybe about 8, a tenth of the room.
Less.
Yeah. All right. So at least with that in mind, let's see what the next question will reveal. So raise your hand if you believe that the IETF should recommend that new working group Yang models should adopt the proposal promoted by the revised data store. Can you go to
What are the questions?
What are the questions? What are the questions?
What questions are you going to be asking now? Are you asking one
And
question?
then, oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, so what are the options? What are the questions you will ask?
And so, yeah, actually, that was just a binary question. I was thinking, do you believe there should be more than one question?
I do. I think we ask is it now or when this document becomes an RFC?
Okay.
I think those are two different.
Well, when it becomes an RFC, then it's definitely. No, when it becomes an RFC, then it's definitely going to be updating the 6087 biz guidelines. So I don't think that's under discussion at the moment. The only discussion is what do we do in the interim between now and when this becomes an RFC. So it's a binary question. Raise your hand if you believe that the IETF should recommend new working group Yang models to adopt the proposal recommended by this draft.
No,
New. Yeah,
This is not existing.
Yeah, okay. New work if they can. And to that mind, for instance, models that are augmenting routing config or interfaces can't. If they can. The recommendation, what would we recommend? Okay, raise your hand now, please. So, okay, that appears to be about half the room, I think.
Well, it's a reasonable number. I don't think we should go to numbers.
Okay, so we will take that.
Do you want to ask how many do not?
Oh, please, thank you. I forgot to do that last time. All right, so how many people do not believe we should make this recommendation to the IETF at this time? Raise your hand, please.
I think we could say one.
No, two.
A few, then a few. So I would say that the first answer was a reasonable number. The second one is a few.
Okay.
For the minutes and for the remote folks.
Okay. And also, I believe this conversation will feed into a Wednesday morning discussion in the routing working group. And also, I believe Friday morning discussion, the MPLS working group is doing a joint session. So probably this discussion will be revisited during those work group discussions. Okay, thank you. Martin.
Can I just point something out? So there's rough consensus, but zero running code in this decision.
Also, keep in mind, consensus in this room is not consensus of the working group, it's just consensus of the room. Consensus of the working group has to be gauged on the working group list. And I think we're headed to a point where this will be judged based on a document, not just on a simple question to a simple email.
So Benoit Claes, so I think that the three of us, we should sit down before the end of the week and have this proposal, if we have time.
I am Hlaďa. I'm going to talk about fourth revision of the schema mount document. The main changes since 03 are these. First of all, we moved away from the requirement to use only AnyData nodes as mount points. The main reason here is that Yang basically requires to take these AnyData nodes as blobs. So using the current Yang rules, it wouldn't be possible to configure anything specifically inside the mounted tree. And of course that's not very useful, and we didn't want to change this Yang rule for the time being. So currently, mount points can be under container and list, not AnyData, and AnyData is not involved at all in this. Second change that's quite difficult one, and I'm going to talk about it more in detail later, is that basically before it was only possible to refer to things inside the so-called mount jail, that it wasn't possible to refer to anything outside the mounted schema. This seems to be quite a restriction, and so we discussed some ways how to deal with this, and one solution is in this revision of the draft. And the third change, which is not very controversial one, I would say, is to enable read-only mounts. It seems to be useful in some cases. Okay, so about the mount point, so now we can have can I point? Oh. Okay, so we can have mount points in two locations in a Yang schema. First is inside a container, like here, or the other option is inside a list. But I would also like to emphasize that even though we are using basically the same mechanism for identifying the mount point, we are using it for two fundamentally different things, because we have these two methods of specifying the mounted schema that are called use schema and inline, and this sometimes causes some confusion, so I would like to clarify it here. First, if we use the use schema method, then this mount point extension basically identifies a location in the schema, right? In the Yang module where this extension appears, it identifies the location in the schema. So it means that in this location, some new schema nodes will be provided, placed, and this is very much the same thing as what you do when you use an augment, right? You just work on the schema. You needn't look at any instance data here. It's really similar to augment, except that the target node for the augment is not specified in place. It's specified somewhere else using some other way. If you, with this use schema method and mount point under a list node, it is basically the same as above. Again, the same as how you would extend a list through an augment. Whereas in the inline case, basically this mount point extension identifies a location in the instance document, right? So it means in the case of a container, it shows a location in the instance tree, in the instance of that container, where instance data are supposed to be placed, including Yang library, plus perhaps other data. But here we are talking about putting some stuff into instance documents. And the difference is especially important because in the case of a mount point under a list, it can be that each entry of the list can have a specific version of this data, so that the schemas for each entry of the list can be completely different. They needn't be, but at least you have to have, for each entry, you have to have a separate copy of this data of Yang library and anything else. Whereas in the use schema case, you really extend just the schema, and you don't need to have multiple copies of this. So please keep this distinction in mind. In fact, I believe these are really two different mechanisms, so maybe it's not really correct to subsume them under the same. This is really, I think this inline case is pretty much like the peer mount, the special case of the peer mount, because we are really working with instance data. So now the difficult thing are these parent schema references. So basically, Why do we need them? Generally, XPath expressions in the mounted schema cannot refer outside the mount jail, because, of course, if the modules inside the mounted schema needn't know about any context, any outside environment, outside of what they consider to be their root. But sometimes this seems too restrictive. A typical use case is the one for network instances described in this internet draft. Basically, we have these interfaces and routing modules, and either we can use it just for a simple router in the way that's indicated here. So the two modules are peer-to-peer, basically. And so this is one option. Another option is to have a router with virtual routing forwarding instances, which means in the NI draft, it's called network instances. And in this case, the idea is to have the list of interfaces at the global level shared by all networking instances, but the routing stuff inside each network instance. And in this draft, they use this root mount point for mounting the routing module and other modules as well. But the idea is that, of course, from routing configuration, it's often necessary to refer to interfaces. But if we have these two different cases, the interfaces are not located at the same place from the viewpoint of routing configuration. So in this case, we would like to be able somehow to point, because the mount jail here is this root mount point, but we want to be able to refer to interfaces that are outside of this. So the question is how to do it. We have considered a number of methods. So this one is what we now have in the current revision. The idea is, and this is only supposed to work for the use schema method, not for the inline way of schema mount. And the idea is that along with specifying the schema, we can also use a list, actually a leaf list named parent reference that lists 1, 0 or more modules. So this is only available for the use schema case, and this escape of the mount jail is only possible for some references, not all references. It means it's defined to be possible only for absolute leaf ref path and instance identifiers, but not for general XPath expressions. I will talk about that a bit later in open issues. Why is that? Basically, the idea is that if we have an absolute leaf ref path inside the mounted schema or an instance identifier, we can look at the first component of that reference, of that XPath path, basically. And if this first, it means the top level node of that path, if it belongs to a module that's listed here in the parent reference, this is automatically, transparently redirected to the parent schema, right? So for these and only for these modules, if they form the top level component of the path, this redirection will take place. Other paths will stay inside the mount jail. So here is an example for the NI. I think I have a mistake here. It should be IETF interfaces here instead of IETF routing and here as well. And the idea is that as soon as we have, for example, a leaf ref reference pointing to an interface, so the leaf ref path will have something, probably interface and its name. in the path. So the first component belongs to the IETF interfaces module, so it will be rerouted and it will use the list in the top level schema, not in the mounted schema. So that could possibly solve the use cases that we are aware about regarding the NI draft, but we are not sure that it will be really sufficient for everybody.
Is there a like next solution, or is this the current solution?
Yes, it's one of the open issues, so I will show some alternative solutions to this.
So I'll ask a clarifying question here. So this is Christian Hops, T-Systems. It seems like I think that I'm seeing the same solution but viewing it differently, and maybe that could clarify if I'm wrong. It could clarify I'm wrong. But parent references, could we also refer to this as parent exposures? I'm viewing this more as like I'm going to expose the root level models of the parent at the root of this new mount point, right? And then I don't have to worry so much about thinking about that it's shooting backwards and, you know, it just works. The exposure. I mean, I think it's just a different way of looking at it. I don't think that it actually changes them.
Oh,
is that right?
I'm not sure. I think we also discussed this option, like making some symlinks inside the mounted schema. But I believe there are some cons of this, and I think Martin mentioned they have this implemented in their software, and this causes some problems for Martin.
Yeah, Martin Möcklen. So to your question, I think that what you're saying is that you would like to also mount the parent module there, right?
Yeah.
And then it's
mounted. It's the same instance data when I refer to.
What, so instance data is different. Right? We're just talking about the schema. So from a schema perspective, you want the model to be mounted there. And if you do that, you don't need these parent references at all. So that is another possible solution to this problem.
Yeah, because some of the not all the models need this, right? Like the L&E model doesn't need this. This is sort of just some models are sort of like light, right? They need to look at the parent, and it seems like if we just in their specifications said they also need they need to have the parents modules mounted, interfaces and whatever NI needs, then it just kind of works. You know, you don't have to worry about back references.
Yeah, so this, Martin Möcklen again, so this thing was supposed to avoid the need for mounting the entire parent module, right? So if you're saying that it's not necessary, then that's much more simple.
Yeah. From a logical sense, I think it's doing exactly what Chris is asking for. So I'm not sure why the answer by Lada was, yeah, think of it that way. Because I think you went a different direction than what Chris was asking about. I think Chris is just saying that the parent, the reference, the models that have a parent reference, you can reference as if they are at the same root as the mounted modules.
No.
Right? Was that confusing? All right.
No.
We just draw it out, but I think the answer to you was actually yes.
Basically, our idea of what this means is to change the way how these XPath expressions are evaluated, these special XPath expressions, the evaluation of these expressions, right? So we explicitly didn't want to have the same data in two different locations, right, because it causes all kinds of problems with logs. So if data are changed in the root mode, in the root schema and not in the mounted schema, what are we going to do? So this will really only change the meaning of some references. So they will be redirected to the parent schema, but the data will still be only available in one place. These interfaces, in this case, will be only available in the top level schema. And there, of course, the mounted schema can refer to these interfaces, which wasn't possible previously.
Yeah, so you said that you have issues with the data. If you duplicate, I don't view it as a duplication of data, right? It's a namespace exposure. It's the same data, right? And I'm just exposing it through two different ways to get to that data. It's like having 2 pointers in C. I think this is even like a Unix file system.
In terms
You
of,
can
of
actually
a
mount.
client, of a netconf or RESTconf client, you can have a client that tries to edit this exposed data in one place, and you can have another client that tries to edit the data in the other location. So that's basically what where the
No, but
problem-
But it's the
But
same
you're
data.
what this right now, the current proposal is limited to the XPaths within the mounted modules being evaluated relative to the root. So if they have apparent exposure, the XPath that would actually be in the mounted module would refer to, let's say, interfaces as if it was at the same root that it exists. So that's the only place that this shows up is in that XPath.
Right, so that's why I said I think it accomplishes almost exactly the same way. I'm just saying let's take out the special casing, saying like, okay, if we just say NI exposes interfaces at NI's root, then we're done, right? We don't have special XPaths. We don't have restrictions on what types of things are implemented that way.
So this is the mechanism that they do that.
Yeah,
It's the
except there's restrictions.
Oh.
I don't know. Like if I'm in the NI, I can use a relative path to refer to my root, right?
Exactly.
I can't do that here. They're saying I can only use absolute.
No, but you can also use in the case of interfaces, you can easily use the absolute path. Also.
What you can't do is from a client reference the parent data from within the root. That's the only thing you can't do. That's the only difference between, I think, what you're saying and what the current document says.
No, actually,
yeah.
With the client, you cannot reference the data inside the mounted. Inside.
That's what I meant to say. I have no idea what I actually said, but that's what I meant to say.
Right.
So anyway, let's get back to what the text says on the slide. It says parent schema is only with absolute pass. Now, Lada, you're saying, oh, that's fine. We'll just use absolute pass. And what I'm saying is that's not the way I viewed this when we originally came up with these ideas, because somebody in some other SDO might write something. We want it all to work.
I have an example on one of the next slides, so maybe I can move there now, or we can discuss it there, because, yeah, I can show why this is difficult.
Alex, just 2 brief comments. So one thing, actually, clearly, I think I view this as schema mount, not as instance, right? I mean, for the instance information, for this is basically where we had peer mount. I think that's about actually separate discussion. Second comment is, yeah, I'm not sure, you mentioned earlier that augments is kind of like the model for that. I'm actually, is it augments or is it really more grouping uses? Because I think that's another way actually to view this, right? In a way, you are reusing the schema or you're reusing things which were not which had not been specified as a grouping originally. If you had a grouping, it could be used there. And I thought this was basically a mechanism to essentially deal with it. So isn't grouping perhaps the more useful analogy here?
So basically, we have to distinguish the 2 methods of that are defined in the schema mount document. The inline method, I do insist on that it is really works with instance data, except that by coincidence, part of this instance data is a Yang library that describes the modules used in the mounted schema. But with the use schema method, I think it's very, very close to an augment, except that, as I said, the target node is not specified along with the data, but somewhere else by some other means. I don't think it has anything to do with groupings. It's completely different. The data have a fixed namespace. There is no way how you can vary the namespace of the node. So it's really very close to an augment. But it's only for the use schema method, right? The inline method is completely different.
Phil Schaefer, Juniper. I have 3 questions. The first is, this is only schema data. This is not instance data. If I make an interface in /interfaces, it's not going to magically show up in the network instance. It's only the schema that's shared.
If you use we assume this NI case will use the use schema method, which is more natural for that. And in this case, it's really manipulation with the schema. No instant data.
No instance data.
So just Martin Björklingen to answer
No,
that question. This document doesn't say anything about instance data, right? So it could magically end up there, or it might not. This document doesn't care. This document only cares about the schema itself. Then how things are implemented is something different.
Well, that's good because I'm talking about this document, not some future document.
Yeah, but there is a document that does what you're talking about, but it's an
I know.
implementation thing. It's a use of the schema. No.
But the language in this discussion keeps switching back and forth, and that's very confusing. The second thing is, to Chris's point, it's not just a mount. You're not really mounting that schema beside you, because there's if there's references inside that schema, how are they satisfied? Are they satisfied in the subtree where they were mounted, or are they satisfied in the root, so to speak?
Basically, previously we thought that this mounts jail, so only inside. All references previously had to be satisfied inside the mounted schema, but then this is one method of one quite a limited method of escaping this mount jail and referencing things outside of it. So,
but my question is for the next level of indirection. If I mount something, if I have a parent reference to the interfaces, are those interfaces references evaluated inside the mount point or inside the top level?
Well, basically, because if this parent reference is used and the evaluator of the XPath expression of the path sees the top level module in this parent reference leaf list, it will basically take the available tree as starting from the global root, not from the mounted root. But I don't know what you mean by evaluated. So that the context, the only change in the XPath evaluation context is that in this case, the available tree will be the global tree, the entire tree, not the mounted tree. Whereas if the top level component of the path is not in this parent reference, the available tree will only be the mounted schema.
So if I'm in A and I mount /B, and /B has a reference to /C, where is B's C evaluated?
Well, first of all, we limited this only to absolute leaf refs. Right? So no dots are available because you need to recognize the top level component in the path to be able to decide whether this redirection takes place or not.
But again, I'm A mounting B, and B has a reference to /C.
And C is where?
And that's my question. There's no in
there's no data. That's what I'm saying. You only need to use absolute path.
So the mounted schema also has to use absolute paths.
If you use a reference that you want to be evaluated in the parent schema, then you need to use, at least currently, you need to use absolute.
So if I use
Phil,
yeah?
These are only top level modules. You're going to do relative references between top level modules? No, the mounted modules are top level modules. You're not mounting in the middle of a module. You're not mounting submodules. You're mounting top level modules.
Okay.
I'm trying to think if it's even allowed. I certainly don't know of any use cases that do it, but you're more of an expert on this than I am, but I can't imagine relative references between top level modules. No, this is at the root.
If you have references between the mounted
Look,
modules.
Phil's just talking about under a node, right? You got a node and a container block when ... module.
So it's mounted, so that's always in the context of the module it resides. You're talking about top level modules, relative. All right, I think we have to take it to the list.
Okay. And the third thing is, so this keeps your jails absolute. Once you have this mount in place, there's no escaping the jail.
Other than the parent reference.
Except of this. Was
Rick Taylor, I'm just coming in. I like this current solution. I needed to get out of the jails, and I think the explicit parent references, because we're talking about schemas, we're not getting caught, and it's very easy to get confused with instance data and think about Unix file systems, which are instance data. This is schema. I like the ability to say, I have a reference to this absolute path in the schema, and it means my validator can be much more precise. Otherwise, you just say, oh, and there's stuff over there. And what's the point of even having a schema then? So
For all the talking I do here, I'm not a modeling geek. So I'm still trying to wrap my head around the schema, which is the description of the instance data, right? Yeah. So when I write the NI model, I'm talking about a VRF. And when I refer to interfaces, I really am referring to physical interfaces on the router, right? And they will exist in the parent model. So, I think, Phil, you said something earlier where I was like, if I don't want there to be new interfaces in NI. So when I just talk about schema, if that's allowed, that's not enough. I need to be able to specify, I'm talking about the parent interfaces, the instance data in the parent. Is that not what we're getting at here? It could be totally different.
I think it would be useful if you give us some examples of.
Well, I just did
exactly want.
interface. I have interface list. It's an example you're giving. The parent has interfaces, and the NI, I've assigned certain interface subset of those interfaces for the VRF to work on, right? I'm talking instance data here. What I heard was the schema, if we're just talking about schema, those don't have to refer to each other. I don't know what the difference is. Why do we keep making that distinction? I'm worried.
It's allowing you to reuse the schema / interfaces under your VRF. If there's no data associated with it, you're just reusing
The schema, the description. I need a tighter coupling, right?
Chris, we're actually really over. I think what you're asking for is there, and we should talk offline. And if it's not there, we'll get it there, and we'll also take the results to the list.
Okay, so let's move to a little bit easier stuff. It's these read-only mounts.
So we've actually run over in the last one, and now we're going to start running over on this one. These are hugely important topics. So, squeezing other things is okay, but maybe focus on the areas that you want feedback from. And, well, go to the point that you really want, that you think is critical to get feedback on.
So this is about the important open issue. There are some others mentioned in the draft, so please have a look. But these are, and maybe the critical one is this one. This is about how to really refer to the mount point. Currently, it's done through a YANG extension. Another option that I would like actually to use is, as in an augment, to use some kind of schema node references. So that would not only avoid using an extension, it would also make it closer to the concept of an augment, because here the target is basically specified exactly as in an augment. But also, it's possible really to separate these two methods of schema mount, this inline and use schema. And there is a possible solution that, in my view, would make quite a lot of sense. And in this case, we could really finish the schema mount draft maybe next week. And so the idea is to do it in 2 steps. And namely to use the mount point extension, but only for the inline case. I believe this is what you also suggested. It means use this extension without further ado, without any further data, but just for this special method of schema mount. it means no escape of the mount jail. I believe some people would be happy with having this solution only, and it's really a no-brainer. There are no big problems with this. We can do it, but then the second point we have to discuss what to do.
Yeah, I think you're characterizing what my suggestion was as a little different. I'm sorry, my suggestion is a little different from what you characterized. What I said is we don't need the mount module schema. Too many words in schema.
State data, right?
We don't need this in the case of inline.
Yes.
You don't need the module structure for inline. So making it so that's not required, that's a good thing. That doesn't mean you want to get rid of the mount point in the non-inline case. I agree that from the strict modeling sense, you don't need it. You can make it work on a technical side. The problem is for the model designers, without that mount point, it's very confusing to know that the mount point shows up. So if we go back to the case of the NI, the network instance example you had a moment ago, there's no, it'll never do inline. NI never will use inline, full stop. But they still want to have the mount point, or I'm co-author of that. We still want a mount point because it's a clue to the designers to know that it's there. It's a clue to the readers to know it's there. So we don't want to eliminate the mount point extension all the time.
Yeah, actually,
and it's a readability thing, and it's an understandability thing. Certainly, from a technical standpoint, yeah, we understand that it's duplicate information.
I have two answers to this. One is that in terms of readability, of course, you can provide a description to indicate that this is supposed to be a mount point, or some other stuff should come in. So in terms of readability, it's okay. We had some discussion whether it's really needed to have it machine readable, this information. I'm not sure how this could be used, except perhaps in indicating the mount point in the tree. And my second...
By the way, that's a really important point right there.
And my second answer is that, in fact, if we again compare it to an augment, and we really use augments in a very similar way, you take an augment, you specify a target node, and then you don't have any augment point extension or something like that. So you just put stuff there. So in terms of the schema definition, it's perfectly okay. If you want to indicate for module authors that this is supposed to be a mount point, you can put a description there. So I don't really think that the extension is needed. Of course, we could use one extension for the inline case and another extension for the second case. That's also possible, but in my view, it's really not necessary. And this schema node identifier tells you everything. I agree that it's maybe it's not written in the parent module in a machine readable way, but I'm not sure it's really so critical.
Rick Taylor again. I think it's quite obvious amongst the discussion today and on the list that actually this is quite a complex issue once you're getting into your mounting schemas and people get confused with instance data, and it's easy to do. I think anything we can do to disambiguate the inline from the use schema case, even if it doesn't need to be there in the purest mathematics of schemas, just so people don't make mistakes and it's nice and obvious. I think that there is benefit to just keeping that in mind.
I cannot agree more, and we can see all the time that people are really confused. Is it an instance mount, or is it data, or is it just schema?
And so that will kill the whole thing unless we get it right.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yep.
So are you saying in case where you have inline, shows up with the extension, great. In the case you don't have inline, where it's controlled this way, you don't want to have a mount point at all in the model where it shows up? It'll only show up sort of equivalent to how an augment shows up.
I don't have the exact answer for that because I need to go away and think about it because it's harder, but I liked your point about for module authors, it's explicit that this is the mount point, even though it doesn't need, so it's obvious that this is a mount point that is designed for the use schema case. And so other authors can go, oh, I get this, it's good. Stuff is going to hang off here.
So
And I
it's
need to think this through properly, sorry.
Yeah, but basically, if you look at the IETF routing module, you can see that the routes are defined there without any next hops, right? So everybody who reads this document must assume that next hops must come from somewhere else, and it's also indicated in a description. And the next hops are provided by the other IPv4, IPv6 modules and augmented into these routes and other places. So it just works fine, and it could work fine exactly the same way if we mount this stuff instead of an augment. So that would be very similar. So yeah, I do agree that it's important to have some indication this is going to be a place where some new schema nodes will appear, but I'm not sure it's really needed to have it machine readable.
Keep in mind that the LNE use case can be either not inline or inline at the same mount point as currently designed. So you want to handle it, you'll have to, whatever solution you come up with has to address both of those cases where you have a single mount point, which based on implementation, they can choose which way they do it.
Okay, but as I said, it's also possible to have another extension. I'm not a big friend of young extensions, I must admit, so that's probably why I also am opposed to using this extension as some kind of fundamental feature in Yang, but we can discuss it. But there is actually another point I would like to make, and this is related to the data stores document, because Martin probably didn't mention that some changes to Yang library are also envisioned, because you need to say for each module to which in which data store this module is implemented. So I mean, if we open this Yang library document and change Yang library structure, I think it would make a lot of sense to integrate the schema mount inside it, so that we will have Yang library as a way of specifying all modules that are used in the entire data model, and the ways how the modules are related to each other. So instead of having two types of state data, we will have just one integrated solution for all this. And I believe this would really make a lot of sense, and we could possibly use it only for the use schema case and deal with this inline case just using the extension without any state data involved. I would like to ask you whether any opinions on this you might consider. I must say that it's only based on our discussion with Martin yesterday, so I couldn't even make it more detailed here, but I think it's something that's really worth considering, provided that we really change the Yang library format.
Let's move on as quickly as possible. We're already 18 minutes over.
All right, so let's discuss it in the mailing list. And here, one comment to the parent not references. So here is an example of a reference that's possible in general XPath. It's some kind of descendant axis, as it is called in XPath. And the problem here is that if we have IETF interfaces listed in parent reference, so although this IP module is augmented to IETF interfaces, it can also possibly appear somewhere else. So it would be possible to tell whether really this path starts with IETF interfaces or not. So for an implementer of XPath evaluator, that would be really terrible thing to handle. And I'm not sure we can really go this way and permit this. So that's why we have that restriction. Of course, there are some other possibilities how to do that. we could somehow indicate this explicitly. One option is to define a new XPath function, for example, parent root, that can be defined, for example, to evaluate to the parent root node or global root node if it's used in the top-level schema. So that would also cover the NI case easily. Or possibly we can introduce the possibility of defining XPath variables and then the appropriate value for the root. So the XPath expression could look like this, and then we can provide somehow, by using some mechanism, the appropriate value for the root variable, and then do it.
I know we're short on time. If we did do the idea of the parent reference actually just bringing in the root level ones, then the /IP IPv4 would refer to whatever ones we brought in plus the ones that are inside our own mount space, right? So it'd work like we'd expect.
Yes, that's right, but we have to discuss how to do it really, because there may be other ramifications of doing so in terms of accessing the data if they are apparently in places. Okay, so the advantage of the current solution is that the modules such as IETF routing needn't take care about this at all. Needn't just consider the option of having something as a parent root, whereas here in both solutions, the module author at least has to anticipate this possibility of having this module either at the top level or mounted under some root, right? But here it would be explicit, so no decision making, no guessing what route to choose. So in a way that this would be much easier to implement.
Lada?
Oh yeah.
I'd like to shift gears for a second. It seems there's interest in having pretty substantive discussions on this draft, which is great. And it's clear that it would be good to get some more feedback. Wondering if how the room feels about scheduling a interim just on this topic as soon as possible. So logistically that means no sooner than 2 weeks, but so let's say 2 to 4 weeks from now. Is there interest for doing that so that we can really have substantive time to go through the issues and understand? Anyone think that's a bad idea? So we're way over on this presentation, so but we're getting good information. Is it okay if we redirect this until we have an interim on it? Does that work for you?
Yep.
I'll try for 5.
So thanks for all the great discussion and also good work.
Okay, can I see this?
It's good to see something that clearly people are so interested in.
See Clyde Wilds. Yeah, do the syslog model. Remote presentation, there we go. And
Okay, next slide, please.
if you can keep it down to 7 minutes, that'd be great.
So since where we presented syslog
We can
model
hear you. Go
11, Alex Campbell and Andy Berman did an in-depth
Yeah, they're
review,
coming up, sorry.
and I really appreciate their feedback. The result has been 3 additional updates, where the most recent update was well, actually yesterday morning early when the submission window reopened. But we've done a bunch of things, mostly to add clarity. I combined syslog types into the base model, so it's no longer a separate file. I added TLS support back in now that the TLS client file is available, a model is available. I removed the buffer and session actions because they cause confusion and they're only implemented by, I think, 2 vendors each. And I made the remaining actions features. And then lastly, I added a certificate signing container to signing options for signed syslog messages. What I need here, Kent, is I need maybe a 30-minute working session with Alex, Clem, and with you, just to confirm that I have it right. If you can help me on that, would be great. And then lastly, I addressed all the editorial comments that we got from Alex and Andy and from you, Kent, Dale, and also Tom Petch. I really appreciate the feedback. Next slide. Okay, great. So next slide. I think it's just a summation. You can, the latest model has been put in, and the tree has been put into the GitHub repo. And you can review the diffs with a link that I included in the slide between the 11 and the 14 version. And so now the last slide is what are the next steps? I guess it's work with you, Kent, and Alex Clem.
So Alex and I nodded our heads.
Put
We're
it
happy to
out
have a
for
working
last
session.
call. Great, thank you. That's it.
Okay, yeah, and I think it would have to go to last call. I mean, we are right now in post last call, but the changes that have been made are substantive, technically substantive, so it probably needs to be looked at just one more time. Hopefully a short last call. Thank you, Clyde. All right, great. And so Anise, oh, sorry, is there a question for Clyde?
I thought I was up next, but.
Oh, so, sorry. Yeah, we're going to change the schedule. We only have time for one more presentation, I believe, which we're going to do if Anise, and we can look at model catalog. And I guess I need to press this button.
Which one are we going to move them to tomorrow?
So we're going to move other presentations to Thursday and cut everyone's time in half, basically. Oops. Sorry, we're having trouble locating the slides.
Data model for configuration.
Yang model catalog.
What is it?
Let me.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'll have to go reload them. I don't know why they didn't download it.
You just finish scroll button.
I guess it's possible. Yeah, sorry about wasting time like this. And, well, they didn't make it, somehow they didn't make it to the download folder. Do you have it on there? If you have it there. No, I have it. I have it. Only so many things at once. Yeah, let me just put it here. All right, sorry, one more time. Why don't you start talking and I'll be up there.
Okay, so this is a readout on the update to the Yang model catalog work that we presented back in Yokohama, those of you who were there. I was just going to recap the motivation very quickly. Basically, from a user or operator perspective, this landscape of Yang models keeps growing and growing, and now we have many more models in IETF as well as many other organizations and projects. I was just at OFC last week and I saw presentations from at least 4 or 5 different projects, all of which have their own Yang models that are supporting not just their projects but also more generally useful. So there's a wide and growing landscape. Can we go to the next slide? And so the idea here was that to provide a sort of central way or registry for operators or users to find models that they actually need and can use together. So I'll skip over the requirements. The new stuff that's in the latest version of the draft basically has come from some of our experience in getting these models implemented with various network device vendors. Basically, we've added some more precise definitions of what these bundles of models actually look like and what kind of constraints they should have on them, and done some other cleanup on simplifying how modules are represented. So a couple of key observations that we've come to from working with implementers. This one is maybe self-evident, but you know, as you get a growing list of modules that are being implemented on a device, and they're getting revved in terms of their versions, starting to think about how they actually work together from a coherence and compatibility point of view starts to get pretty complicated. So we have issues where a particular device implementer might rev a subset of the modules, and then the question is always, well, what other modules do I need to also uprev in order to be compatible with the new set of models? So as this landscape grows of models that are supported by a device, this gets harder and harder. So having some machine-readable way to express the compatibility set of modules starts to become more and more important. The second observation was that implementations happen piecemeal. We haven't found any vendor yet who's able to implement a model in its entirety all at once, right? So models get implemented in bits, and it actually becomes then difficult to specify, or there's no way really to specify which parts of the model you need a vendor to implement except through, you know, fairly manual means. So the other motivation we had was, you know, can we create a machine-readable way to give a set of a compliance unit, if you will, to a vendor and say, okay, here are the set of features or functions that we need from this model, and this is where you should focus your implementation effort. Because especially for larger models, if you look at some of the models, there's no way that you'll get everything at once. So the organization of the catalog hasn't changed too fundamentally. So at the top level, we still have a list of organizations, and this will become clear a bit later, but essentially the idea is that you know, each organization, whether it's a SDO or an open source project or some industry group or even a vendor, can publish their own sets of any of these artifacts. And so the main artifacts that we have in the catalog are, of course, Yang modules. We have these things called release bundles, which I'll explain, feature bundles, which have a much more precise definition, which I'll also explain, and then implementations, which I won't have time to get into. But implementations, as you might imagine, are essentially published information about implementations of modules or bundles that maybe a vendor or some other software implementer has provided in the catalog. So the modules is kind of what you might expect. It's essentially metadata about the modules themselves. We've also included information about the classification of modules for adopting the IETF classification draft and leaving room to extend to other classification taxonomies if you want to. You know, you have the list of submodules. The submodules aren't cataloged separately. They all go with their modules. They're not really independently useful anyway. And then some information about how to access, where you go download the model, what its checksum is, etc. And you might extend that to having other sort of credential information so you can authenticate the veracity of the model. So release bundles are about ensuring compatibility, right? So we basically have release bundles that consist of members, where a member can either be another module. So a release bundle is a set of modules, or it can consist of a composition of other release bundles. And the idea here is that the members list includes the set of compatible versions of that module or bundle. And this can just be a scalar list of versions that are known to work together. And there might be wildcards in these versions. So if you're using semantic versions, as we do in the open config models, for example, you could include wildcards that say that any 1.x version of this module will work in this release bundle. So then feature bundles is perhaps a little bit more interesting. So feature bundles, we've changed the definition of these in the current draft to basically be an expression of the schema paths that define the feature that you want. So if you think about this as an operator or a user, essentially you have a model, let's say the BGP model, but you're only using specific features, all the basic features. You don't care about some of the more esoteric things. You can specify the set of paths that comprise the feature set that you use here. So you can specify exactly what's needed for compliance with your use case to a vendor or an implementer, for example. And then these schema paths are drawn from a release bundle. Obviously, those paths have to be expressed against a set of compatible modules. So you can imagine defining a release bundle that consists of maybe a set of different modules across different functional areas. Let's say interfaces, some IP routing protocols, maybe QoS, and a few other things. And then define features in a way that's also composable. So here, a feature bundle can also be composed of other features. So imagine defining a low-level feature for just interfaces that then could be included by a sort of higher-level feature bundle that defines what the IP router functionality would be. Or if you wanted to have an MPLS router, which is more complex than the IP router, you can now reuse these feature bundles. So you don't need to redefine them for every set of features that you need. As an operator, I have some roles that only require very simple functionality, and I'll define my feature set that way. I have more complex roles that require more functionality, and I can define a feature bundle that way. And then I can give these to the implementer or the vendor and say, okay, for this role that I want to pilot, here are the set of features or schema paths that you must implement for me to be able to use this. And then finally, just a couple of additional notes. The reason that we organize the catalog by organization is so that you could, for example, ACL different parts of the catalog to different entities who can manage their own address, or their own entries rather. So the administration of the catalog could be distributed in that sense, even if it's hosted, let's say, centrally. The catalog is different from the thing you would query on a device. So this is basically a central registry of what's available, expressions of bundles, etc. But you still need to interrogate a device to learn what models are actually supported on it. That's a separate issue that we're not really addressing with the model catalog. And then finally, I'll just point out that I think Benoit has been leading a little team that's been doing some nice work at the hackathon to actually implement a prototype of this thing. I believe it's available at yangcatalog.org. Am I allowed to say it publicly? Okay. I just wasn't sure if you all go there whether it would crash the site or not, but hopefully not. So anyway, I think we've made some good progress here, informed by our experience with implementers. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Benoit, please. So thank you for that. So I like the draft day one, right? Because it's important to get the catalog of all the models. So what we've been doing in the hackathon is populating all the Yang models we know of. IEEE, BBF, etc. Then we've got a Yang database search for someone who wants to design a Yang module. I want like a MAC address. Is there like a definition somewhere? Something like that. Then you mentioned across SDO. I agree with that. What we did in the hackathon is that we integrated all the BBF, broadband forum Yang modules in there, and we've got this maturity. It's the RFC, working document, individual. It's also important to understand, right, with the bottleneck in the IETF and which ones we have to work on. Now, I come also from a different angle, from the support, right, because with my AD hat on, I want to know if we're working with the right models, right? So I want to understand if some models are already supported by many vendors, right? So what we did is that we populated from the netconf hello message, we got a script to populate the Yang models, deviation, capabilities, etc. Now, looking at your Yang model, I was very surprised not to see the IETF Yang library structure in there, because this is what we want to use, right? Whenever people will be, it's almost the same, right? The same type of information. But whenever servers will implement that, it will be easy to just get the information and populate it. So I've got some feedback like this. I've got some more. Maybe we can talk offline.
Yeah, I mean, I think introducing a container that has the Yang library exact data coming back from devices would be fine. I mean, we thought actually about creating a separate entry for things like deviations, the way the library does, but we decided to just view the deviation as if you wrote a module that defines just deviations, you would just list it as a module. Maybe the description would indicate that. But I think we can look at those kind of options to include the library more directly.
And as you mentioned multiple times, we have to work with code. So we did, and we also discovered it was not easy to map. If you only have the netconf hello message, to map this to the feature in the IETF Yang library. So maybe I'll drop an email to mailing list or. So, good.
Sure.
John Messenger, it just struck me that the issue you raised where implementations don't implement the whole of a module, but they implement little bits, is a really big problem. And the idea of formalizing the documentation of that problem as feature bundles worries me as a standards activity. It seems like one is having to go back to cover basically errors through a documentation process where it would be better if the effort could have been spent in either ensuring compliance to those modules or to allowing those modules to specify which parts of them are implemented and which parts are not. Because the interoperability value of a model completely depends on everybody supporting all the required parts. And if they're not, then you really don't have an object of major value in the industry at all. And although we're in huge flux with Yang, I do think we need to formalize that somehow, because otherwise it's just chaos.
Yeah, I'll comment, and then I'm sure Rob has another comment to add based on implementation experience we've had. I mean, I think what we've seen though is that the reality is, every module that's published, even the IETF modules, vendors will have deviations against those until they reach full compliance. So, this isn't a substitute for publishing deviations. It's just a way that as a user, I need specific features to be able to use this in my automation, right? So I want a machine readable way where I can give you a very precise definition of what those paths are. I mean, I agree with you, it would be fantastic if that perfect world existed where the entirety of the module was implemented. But until we get there, we need some way to deal with this practical problem, I think. And by the way, I don't think this problem is going away.
Rob Shakir, Google. I don't actually think it's can be characterized like you just need to get around to implementing this. There will be devices that just don't support subsets of features on subsets of BGP, whatever, right? We're not going to support L3 VPN on this box because we don't run it. If that's the case, then this compliance measure gives you a way to be able to express those are the things that you want to support without needing if feature absolutely everywhere. I mean, if we tried to use if feature here, I think we'd end up having to have every leaf almost, or every combination of leaves try to have a feature that specified their support. This is it's maybe more pragmatic. It's maybe not as a neat standards thing, but it's reality of how we're going to have systems in the real world, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, so Anis, what are your thoughts for what we should do with this draft?
I mean, we're happy to progress it if there's interest. It sounds like there's interest. If people find this a useful direction. I mean, we're trying to use this with some of the implementers that we work with. It seems to be a useful construct.
Okay, great. So with that, maybe we can ask the room. Raise your hand, please, if you'd like. Oh, I'm sorry. Before I get to that, recall earlier we had a discussion about the priorities and distractions, right, to those priorities. So I want I want to discuss, adopting, or at least see what the interest in the room is for adopting this as working group charter item. But at the same time, keep that in mind when you make that decision. Okay, so with that, please raise your hand if you're interested in adopting this as working group item.
Very good number.
Very good number. And if you're not interested in adopting this as working group item, please raise your hand. And that would be nobody. Okay. Oh, sorry.
Well, actually, because what we've been working on hackathon, we've been modifying this Yang model, right? And the more stuff we will need it in a catalog, the more it will update, it will be updated. So I see this as a living document, actually, for my part of the world in the yangcatalog.org, right? So if we publish this, then the next time we need an extra metadata, because we might need more, we will need more, right? We'll need to update again. Just a question mark.
Yeah. Well, that's the great thing about a working group document. It doesn't die, it doesn't freeze once it's adopted. That's the start of the working group's work. So we'll have some time, and when it goes to publication, then you should be asked that question of whether it makes sense to publish formally or do something to make it more living.
Yeah, you know my view on whether we need to rush to turn it into an RFC or whether we can iterate on it for a while, right? So,
no, I don't.
So amount of metadata in the model is really discipline. We should encourage to include more descriptive metadata. So when you look at what it is, you really know what it is. Should be part of probably Young Doctor Review or any other data model review that's happening within working group.
Okay, great, thank you. And we'll confirm that consensus on the list. Okay, so just one last closing item. Earlier, Lou mentioned taking the schema mount discussion to an interim. What we meant to say would be taken to a virtual interim, and we'll be scheduling a virtual interim in the next 2 to 4 weeks. Okay, great, thank you. Oh, and the drafts that were on today's schedule that we did not get to, they will be presented first on Thursday's meeting, and we'll have to, of course, squeeze on the other drafts that were planned for Thursday's meeting. Thank you.
Blue sheets, where are the blue sheets? So my script. That's the one. Be down. That was fun. I also fixed my email. I had a problem with it, so it's sort of hard. That'll be easier. Thank you, Ben. Does somebody have the second blue sheet?